Today. Today is Wednesday, 30th October, and we're starting to get dribbles of information about the extent of the Israeli attack on Iran, though that information is still very incomplete, and it could be that lots of things took place which are still hidden from us. Suffice to say that we have some satellite data and some information from the Iranian side. And as to the satellite data, I'm going to simply summarize what Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama says about this. As I've discussed many times, I'm not a person to examine photos and pictures provided by satellites and draw any firm conclusions from them. My vision issues play a part. My lack of expertise in damage assessment an even greater part. But anyway, this is what Bernhardt says, and I think he's mirroring here what many others say about the satellite photos we've seen up to now. There were eyewitness reports from Iran which described an attack on an industrial building as having come from cruise missile-like drones in a northern to southern direction. This would be consistent with drones launched by Israeli, perhaps proxy forces from Azerbaijan. The Iranians have been extremely concerned about Azerbaijan's relations with Israel and have apparently given warnings to the Azerbaijani government about those. Azerbaijan, however, owes Israel a significant debt because Israel did supply significant military material to Azerbaijan in advance of Azerbaijan's successful war against Armenia in 2020. So it may be that the Azerbaijanians, whatever their current feelings, feel that they still have, at least at the moment, to repay this debt to the Israelis, and it could be that drone attacks of some kind from Azerbaijani territory on Iran did indeed take place. The damage does not appear to have been particularly significant. And then Bernhardt goes on to say, in total, the outcome of the attack seems to have been minor. Well, that's his assessment. An old Hawk anti-air missile site seems to have been destroyed. This is, for me, a real puzzle. I mean, if it is indeed a Hawk anti-aircraft missile position, then it presumably would have used Hawk missiles supplied by the United States during the time of the Shah of Iran. So the system in question would be at least 50 years old, which seems astonishing given that it would have survived through the entire Iran-Iraq war period and all the many conflicts that Iran has had since then. And I'm frankly surprised that such a system could still be operational and would be an Israeli target. But never mind, that's apparently what the satellite pictures say. I've read that in several places. A S-300 air defense site showed some signs of disturbance, but those might have been caused by the launch of its missiles. The latter is what I've heard more people say. 3 industrial buildings allegedly used for solid fuel missile motor production have been hit, but there have been no reports of secondary explosions at those sites, which one would expect if fuel had been hit. Now, over and above that, there's also reports that another building, another factory building, where Shahid drones, those are the original drones upon which the Russian Uranium-2 drones are based, that a building producing those kind of drones has also been hit somewhere in Iran. Anyway, if this is indeed the totality of what the Israelis achieved with their missile strike, then it does indeed seem somewhat underwhelming, in fact, very underwhelming. But of course, it could be that lots of other things have happened about which we are not being kept properly informed by either side. What I am going to say at the moment about the situation with the Israeli strike on Iran is this. The Israelis are being very quiet about what they achieved, which is at odds with this having been a particularly powerful and effective strike based on Israeli conduct in the past. Historically, when the Israelis have conducted a successful attack on the facilities of another country, then they are usually the first people to talk about it and to provide all kinds of information and details and to fill the Israeli media with details and often photographs and pictures. One thinks back to attacks like the two successful attacks on the Osirak nuclear power plant in Iraq, for example, in the 1980s, the attack on a building in Syria, which was supposed to be involved in some kind of Syrian nuclear weapons program. Anyway, lots of examples historically going all the way back, as I remember, to the early 1970s of the Israelis providing a huge amount of information about strikes that they carried out which were successful. So the fact that they're not being so informative this time may suggest that this strike was either less successful or less high-powered, less effective, less powerful than they led us all to expect that it would be, that they pulled their punches. Of course, it could be that for all sorts of reasons, the Israelis have changed their policies here and that they're now being much more discreet about what they do. But nonetheless, I do find it interesting that they're saying so little. By now, I would have thought that they would have had quite a lot of information to verify what they achieved. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to say about the Israeli strike. The Israelis are saying unusually little about it. The Iranians, of course, are also saying relatively little about it, but they do seem to be, I won't say exactly buoyant, but at any rate, they're not showing much sign of disarray or alarm or shock after what has happened, which suggests that what did happen was not on such a scale as to exactly shock them. So that perhaps also tilts us somewhat to the view that the attack was not particularly powerful, or not as powerful, again, as we'd been led to expect. Of course, it could be, it's quite possible, that the Iranians are putting on a brave face, that they don't want to acknowledge how powerful the Israeli strike was, that they're following some command from their supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, which is not to exaggerate, but also not to underestimate the power of the Israeli strike, and that, as I said, this is a front that the Iranians are making. But I have to say again, that isn't exactly the pattern with Iran either. Anybody who's followed Iranian politics and who reads the Iranian media at all know that this is actually a highly disputatious country. When things go wrong, there is a huge amount of finger-pointing and recrimination and criticism within the elite, and it's extremely difficult to keep it under control. Anyway, these are impressions. As I said, I'm not absolutely certain that this is true, that the Israeli strike was as low-powered in its effect as these preliminary pieces of information suggest. But it is what we have. And it's what the information that we've been provided up to this point. Now, that then leads us to the other big question of why. Why was this Israeli strike less powerful than many assumed? Well, there are two views. The first view is the one that I discussed in a program a couple of days ago, which is that the Israelis pulled their punches, that their original plan was to launch a far more powerful strike on Iran than they had, than the one they did eventually launch, that the Pentagon, the United States, exerted immense pressure to scale the operation down. The result was that when the Israelis intended to go ahead, someone in the United States published 2 classified documents that provided information about the strike that caused the strike in its original form to be called off, and a much less powerful strike to be substituted in its place. And that remains, I think, a possibility. It's not one that one should discount. I gave weight to it in the previous video where I discussed it. But there is an alternative view, and it is starting to gain traction, and it is one which I notice has been strongly promoted by Alistair Crook, former British diplomat, person I have had the pleasure both to meet in person. It was a very interesting and informative conversation that I had with him, by the way. I learned an awful lot from him about the situation in the Middle East. And of course, Glenn Deason and I have been fortunate to interview him on several programs in the Duran. And of course, he's been interviewed by many other people in many other places as well. Anyway, Alistair Crook, of course, knows this region with a detail and with authority that I obviously don't. He knows the Israelis. He's spoken to many Israeli officials. He's had many dealings with them at many times. He knows all of the various parties involved. He knows the Iranians. He knows the various Arab players, Hezbollah, Hamas. He's visited their various facilities. He's familiar with all of the various governments. And anyway, and of course he speaks the local languages, and he has a degree of knowledge that, as I said, I simply cannot match. And he's also got sources in all of these governments. And I think this is an important thing to bear in mind, because he's also very, very well connected indeed and extremely well informed. And if you've been following his commentary about the events in the Middle East since the start of the conflict on the 7th of October 2023, I'm going to suggest that events have actually evolved very much along the lines that he said. He's described Israeli policy and Israeli thinking, it seems to me, very accurately. And he's been also very accurate about the mood and the thinking in places like the Hamas leadership and the Hezbollah leadership, and in Iran and in the wider Arab world as well. So he has a proven track record. And he is saying something different, that something actually rather different took place over the course of the Israeli strike. And coming from him, we must take this extremely seriously. Now, what he's saying is that the Israeli strike was indeed intended to be a very, very big and very, very powerful one. And that the reason it has turned out otherwise is not because of American pressure or the leaking of classified documents in the United States, or because of second doubts in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It is because the Iranians successfully parried the Israeli strike. Basically, what Alistair Crook says is that the strike that we have seen was intended to be only the first wave of 3 successive strikes that were to take place over the course of a period of, I presume, well, I'm going to guess, around 24 hours. Firstly, the missiles would be launched and they would destroy the Iranian air defenses. Then the fighter jets, the stealth fighter jets, the F-35s, would close in, and there would be many strikes over the course of several hours, and far more damage was intended than the damage that we have actually seen. Except things went wrong. Firstly, the Iranian air defenses turned out to be much more effective in shooting down Israeli missiles than the Israelis had expected. And there is, I have to say, some evidence of this, though it's difficult to judge how much weight one should put on it. But it does look as if the Iranians did succeed in shooting down some Israeli missiles. Again, it's impossible to say how many or what proportion of the missiles which were launched, because the Israelis haven't told us how many missiles they launched, nor have the Iranians given us any numbers. But anyway, some Israeli missiles do appear to have been shot down. There was a rather evocative film which I have seen, which shows a cluster of lights moving apparently across the sky, the night sky of Tehran. I presume these are the discharges of Israeli missiles. So it's a cluster, it's a barrage of missiles. And then suddenly the lights go out and we see all kinds of flashes and bangs and noises. And, well, one possible interpretation, and let me again say, I'm not any kind of authority in interpreting pictures like this, is that the reason the lights all suddenly went out is that the missiles were shot down, perhaps their engines stopped, but at this point the air defense came and we could see all sorts of flashes and bangs and all kinds of things like that. The important thing is we don't see any big explosion on the ground, at least not that I could see. Of course, it could be that the film was edited. I mean, I'm not going to speculate too far. But anyway, it does look as if the Iranians probably did shoot down some Israeli missiles. And by the way, this picture, for what it is worth, also tends to support a masterly analysis of the Iranian air defense system, which was provided to me by a member of the Duran community from India. He described an Iranian air defense system which, though it does possess some very powerful long-range missiles, is principally focused upon short-range point defense. In other words, short-range missiles and cannons, guns, controlled obviously by sophisticated radar systems, but tasked with shooting down missiles as they approach their target positions. Very similar, in other words, to the Russian Tor and Pantsir systems that have been the mainstay of the Russian air defense system in the war in Ukraine. It's the S-300s and S-400s that get the main attention, but I get the sense that it is in fact the Pantsir and the Tor systems in Ukraine which have been most effective in shooting down missiles like the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow and the others. And it looks as if the Iranian air defense system is organized in a similar way. Anyway, that was my impression from looking at these pictures. But then, of course, as I said, that's only my view. So it could be that the Iranians were indeed more successful in shooting down missiles, and that the air defense system overall stood up more effectively to the Israeli attack than the Israelis anticipated. It is interesting that the only site that seems to have been completely destroyed was what must have been an ancient Hawk anti-aircraft missile battery, which, as I said, presumably dates back to the 1970s, if that is indeed what it was. But according to Crook, it seems that there were other things that happened as well, which caused the Israelis to call things off. It wasn't just that the Iranian air defense system withstood the initial attack better. It's also that the Israeli aircraft, including the stealth aircraft, the F-35s, discovered to their dismay that they were being tracked by long-range radar systems. And one assumes that these were Iranian radar systems, and of course that begs many questions, because it would mean if they were Iranian systems produced indigenously by the Iranians had produced them themselves, that Iranian air defense technology is far more advanced than anybody had suspected, which begs many questions. Or alternatively, and perhaps more plausibly, that Iran has received advanced radars from Russia, which is highly likely, and that these radars were more successful in tracking stealth aircraft, F-35 aircraft, than the Israelis had anticipated. And the fact that their aircraft were being tracked and that the air defense missile system was still in operation, had survived the initial attack, was enough for the Israelis to realize that they would face significant losses if they pressed ahead, and to call the entire operation off. Now, if that is true, then that is a dramatic shift in the balance of power in the Middle East. It would mean that Iran, in air defense terms, is far more powerful than anyone had anticipated, and it also would mean that Iran's missiles, its own missile capabilities against Israel, are also far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. And on the second, we have now had a most interesting series of articles, including a particularly interesting one in, of all places, The Economist, which is starting to flag up again the problems with the US's own ability to keep both its own military and those of its allies supplied. So we're now reading articles in which the United States, US officials are privately saying that there is a significant shortage of air defense missiles. They're not apparently prepared to say which air defense missiles, but realistically, there's only three. There's the THAAD missiles, which was supposedly only 1,000 are in existence. The Patriot missiles, which are apparently still the only ones that are being produced in any numbers. And the very sophisticated missiles of the Aegis system that is used by the American warships, and I discussed in a recent program that apparently production of those missiles is now at incredibly low level. We're talking about something like, I seem to remember, a dozen a year or something on that scale. So the United States no longer has the ability to apparently plug holes in the air defense systems of its allies in the way that the allies would wish. And the United States is having to make decisions about whether or not to supply its allies with weapons, because doing so would risk creating risks, and this is what the articles say. It would put the American military defense posture in jeopardy. It could leave the United States itself short of essential weapons in the event of a major war in which the United States found itself directly involved. And in fact, as to what that war would be, we've actually had more reports. There's apparently been a major American military exercise underway, I believe in Alaska, in which the US military has been training in preparation for a potential war against China, whose, of course, colossal industrial power means that their capacity for missile production is effectively limitless. I remember reading an article in Asia Times about a year ago, which said that China could, in theory, produce up to 10,000 cruise missiles a week, which would be equivalent to the entire American arsenal of cruise missiles. I mean, I found that a staggering claim. I'm not sure that it's true, but certainly the Chinese have the ability to produce missiles on a scale that it is clear now that the United States itself cannot match. I will quickly say that this massive imbalance in industrial and manufacturing power is the single biggest factor currently playing out in international affairs, in the overall geopolitical and military strategic balance. Whatever it is that the United States would like to do in places like Ukraine, the Middle East, the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the reality is that it faces resource constraints of a scale that greatly limit its ability to do things. Many commentators, especially neocon commentators, but many commentators in the Western media are still in denial about this. They still talk of the United States producing, being apparently capable of producing limitless quantities of weapons. I read an article by Simon Tisdall, for example, my old friend, in The Guardian, talking about the conflict in Ukraine, talking about how much more powerful the NATO alliance is as against Russia, for example, and why it would have been actually almost risk-free for the United States to admit Ukraine into NATO and to threaten the Russians if the Russians dared to press forward with their conflict against Ukraine. Tisdall is living in a world which perhaps existed in the 1990s, but which does not exist any longer today. As I think it was one of the articles in The Economist conceded, the Russians are producing at least 3 times more shells a year than the European Union is. Probably, by the way, than the entire combined West is. And that's only the Russians. And Russia is a small industrial power compared with China, which in industrial terms operates on a completely different scale to everyone else. China's industrial capacity, to repeat again, is greater than that of the United States, all of the United States' NATO allies, Japan and South Korea lumped together. So that's the scale of the challenge that the United States faces today. And the United States, at least the Pentagon, which is aware of all of this, simply cannot take on commitments in the kind of way that neocons and their followers in the media appear to imagine. So, coming back to the crisis between Israel and Iran, the Iranians have demonstrated that they have the ability to strike targets in Israel. According to the British media, to the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times, around 36 Iranian missiles struck Israel's Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, doing we know not what level of damage, just to say, but they did manage to get through, and the United States simply does not have the air defense resources to stop Iranian attacks like that if they are repeated. And of course, Israel, with its far smaller industrial base, doesn't have those sort of resources either. So that's what I wanted to say in terms of the overall balance between Iran and Israel. If the Alistair Crook theory is true, then Iran can strike Israel, but Israel can strike Iran to a much more limited degree than we had been led to believe up to now. Now, is Alistair Crook's theory, is what he's saying true? I mean, he obviously has his sources, and as I said, we should take information that he provides based on his sources extremely seriously. I certainly do. I have no reason to believe that he's being misled by his sources. And having met Alistair Crook, I would say straight away that he's a person with the kind of experience and the kind of knowledge of the region and of the people he's dealing with to probably work out very quickly if they were spinning him a yarn, just to say. But can we corroborate it? Can we find any pieces of information that might corroborate the account that he's giving, which is independent of the sources that are speaking to him? Well, I'm going to suggest that there is one piece of information, and I mentioned it in an earlier program, and that is that on the eve of the Israeli strike on Iran, reports suddenly appeared that American refueling aircraft were being deployed in large numbers to the Middle East. I seem to remember that we were talking about something like 10 KC-135 air refueling aircraft. Now, I got that news a day before just before I was going to do a program, in which I said that this news strongly suggested that an Israeli strike was about to happen. It was one of the 2 days that have recently happened when I was very ill and was unable to do a program. But it was one of the first clues that an attack by Israel was going to take place. Now, 10 KC-135s seem to me to be a large number of air refueling aircraft. And they suggest a plan worked out by Israel and the United States, which would have required Israeli aircraft to operate beyond their normal ranges so as to require refueling. And that suggests a plan requiring Israeli aircraft to conduct airstrikes against Iran itself. In other words, to enter Iranian airspace. The Indications, however, are that no Israeli aircraft did, in fact, reach Iranian airspace. Now, there is an article in the Washington Post, I believe, which claims otherwise, but it mentions the fact that the Israeli aircraft entered Iranian airspace very, very much in passing, and I don't place any great weight on it, just to say. Most reports agree that the airstrike, the missile strike, was carried out on Iran from a distance by Israeli aircraft operating in Syrian and Iraqi airspace. In fact, the Iraqis are angrily complaining about the fact and are talking about the fact that this was an invasion of their airspace and was completely unacceptable. So it looks as if, and of course the Iranians themselves are saying, that no Israeli aircraft did actually enter their airspace. Now, if that is true, then it would seem that the KC-135s weren't needed and weren't used, which then begs the question of why they were deployed to the Middle East in the first place. It looks as if it could be that they were intended to assist in a much more ambitious strike against Iran than the one we eventually saw, and that pretty much in the way that Alistair Cook says, the attack was called off at the last moment when the Israeli aircraft were being tracked by someone's radar, and the Iranian air defense system proved stronger than the Israelis had anticipated. Well, there's a lot of discussion and speculation here, and I want to make it very clear that, I'm just piecing things together. We only have limited amount of information, and it could very well be that over the next few days and weeks, we're going to get a completely different sense of what actually took place. And I'm prepared to accept that, in which case, all that you've just heard will have to be revisited, and much of it will have to be completely reconsidered. But I have to say, for the moment, I very much am leaning to thinking that Alistair Cook's version of events could well be true. That certainly some people in Washington weren't happy with what the Israelis tried to do. Some people in Washington were so alarmed that they published classified documents trying to get the whole thing called off. The president, however, was said to be furious about this, Joe Biden. The Israelis seem to be intent, therefore, to press ahead. Then the attack took place, and it didn't happen as intended, not because a decision was made to pull punches, but because the resistance proved stronger at a technological level than the Americans and the Israelis had anticipated. Someone in Israel certainly seems very unhappy with what happened, because there were reports 2 days ago that the Israeli cabinet has made another decision to launch further attacks on Iranian targets, which of course might not be in Iran itself, in retaliation for the attacks on Prime Minister Netanyahu's various residences by Hezbollah drones, and that there's now apparently further plans being hatched in Israel for decapitation strikes, not against Iran any longer, but against Syria, with none other than President Assad of Syria apparently being the target. So that looks as if someone in Israel is very unhappy with the strike which did take place, and they're thinking of launching further strikes elsewhere. Anyway, this is a very, very complex story, but I would say that for the moment, at least, it doesn't look to me as if anything fundamentally has been resolved in the military situation in the Middle East. The fighting in Lebanon continues, but we'll just see. We will just see how things play out, and what the Israelis do, and what the Americans do, and what the Russians do, and what the Iranians do over the next couple of weeks. Hezbollah has a new leadership, by the way. They're continuing to launch strikes on Israel. I've even heard it suggested that the strikes by Hezbollah are gradually intensifying. Again, I don't know that this is so. The Israelis have issued a plan and further demand, which they're now apparently putting before the Lebanese government rather than Hezbollah, to try to get Hezbollah to force Hezbollah beyond the Litani River, as was originally envisaged, according to Israeli and American interpretations, by a ceasefire agreement reached in 2006. Hezbollah apparently continues to say no, and the fighting goes on. So anyway, that is my interpretation of the situation in the Middle East. The fighting continues, the negotiations continue. Whether there's going to be a ceasefire or not in Lebanon or in Gaza remains, it seems to me, uncertain. But for the moment, my sense is of a less powerful Israeli strike on Iran than many suggested, and of a rather a much more strong Iranian response than was suggested either. So anyway, let's move on and let's talk about other things that are taking place in the world. As all of these events in the Middle East continue to play out with all sorts of uncertainties about which we cannot be completely sure, President Putin of Russia remains incredibly busy. He continues to impose upon himself a punishing schedule of meetings and decisions. And over the last couple of hours, he's presided over two. Now, one has attracted a certain amount of international attention, which is that he has supervised from his office in the Kremlin. By the way, and for the record, Stalin's old office in the Kremlin. Putin has inherited that office, which was previously occupied by President Yeltsin. And President Yeltsin's office, President Yeltsin chose in the 1990s to move his office into what had been Stalin's office previously. During the Soviet period, after Stalin's death, it had been retained as a kind of museum. But anyway, Putin, from his office in the Kremlin, supervised an exercise of Russia's strategic nuclear forces. And the Kremlin has provided a fairly interesting account of this exercise. It turns out that no fewer than 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles were launched. One was a Yars road mobile ballistic missile launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome space station, in other words, which is located north of the Arctic Circle, I believe in the Kola Peninsula. But the other two ballistic missiles were a Sea-Never, sea-based ballistic missile, launched from, I presume, a Delta-class submarine, and a very sophisticated Bulava ballistic missile launched from a more modern ballistic missile submarine, operating respectively in the Barents Sea and in the Barents Sea in the Arctic, and the Sea of Okhotsk in the Pacific, in the area close to Japan, Japanese waters. Well, not, of course, straight in Japan, but anyway, in that area. So 3 ballistic missiles were launched. We're also told that Tupolev 95M MS, long-range strategic bombers, also participated. And the Kremlin tells us that this was a regular training exercise for the strategic deterrent forces. And Putin made a number of interesting comments over the course of this exercise about the Russian approach to use of nuclear weapons. He said, "I would like to emphasize that Russia reaffirms its principal stance that the use of nuclear weapons is an extreme, exceptional measure for ensuring state security. We fully recognize that the nuclear triad remains a solid pillar of our country's sovereignty and security. It enables us to achieve strategic deterrence objectives and uphold nuclear parity and the balance of power globally, which are key factors underpinning global security." Then he went on to say this: "In light of escalating geopolitical tensions and the emergence of new external threats and risks, it is important for us to have modern strategic forces that are in a state of constant combat readiness. We shall continue to enhance all their components as we possess the necessary resources to do so. I must stress that we do not intend to be drawn into a new arms race. However, we will maintain our nuclear forces at a level of necessary sufficiency." So he says that Russia is not going to try to stay ahead of the United States or compete with the United States in every single area of nuclear weapons competition, but they will continue to build up their nuclear forces and to maintain their nuclear arsenal at a level that is sufficient to impose deterrence on the United States. And of course, it is the United States which he is referring to when he speaks about escalating geopolitical tensions and the emergence of new external threats. He's referring to the United States and to NATO. And he also went on to say that the modernization of the Strategic Defense Forces arsenal has reached approximately 94%. That's 94% over and above what the Soviet Union used to have. And we will progressively transition our strategic missile forces to new fixed-site and mobile missile systems, which compared to previous generations are more precise, need less pre-launch time, and what's crucial, have advanced capability to penetrate missile defense systems. Furthermore, the commissioning of the latest nuclear-powered submarine cruisers, he means the Borei class. These are the submarines that carry the Bulava, the very advanced Russian Bulava missile system, into the Navy continues, alongside the modernization of long-range strategic bombers. And on that, he is referring to the fact that the Russians have relaunched production of the supersonic Tupolev 160 strategic bomber. And there are many reports, very difficult to chart and confirm, that the Russians are on the brink of testing their new subsonic stealth bomber, which supposedly will be entering service sometime around 2030. Anyway, that's what Putin had to say about the strategic situation. Now, the Russians do not, of course, need to compete directly with the United States in the way that they did during the Cold War, because another power has entered the game in a big way, and that, of course, is China. The Chinese are busy also modernizing and upgrading their strategic nuclear force. And of course, the Chinese and the Russians maintain very close contacts on military matters with each other. The Russian news agency TASS has gone out of its way to say that the most important single meeting that Putin held in Kazan was the one between himself and President Xi Jinping of China. And the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov was recently in Beijing, where he had a high-level meeting with the top officials of China's defense ministry. So the Chinese and the Russians work closely with each other. They coordinate closely on military policy, and that includes, by the way, nuclear weapons policy. It is the secret that everyone knows, even if they don't acknowledge the fact publicly that they are working together. In practice, they're going to be making sure that their military strategic developments are complementary with each other. But the other thing about these words of Putin is that yet again, he's clearly signaling a warning to the West. Why else would he talk about the escalating geopolitical tensions and the emergence of new external threats? And why else would he say it is imperative for us to have modern strategic forces that are in a state of constant combat readiness? What he is telling the Americans is, if the Americans have any dangerous plans, if they are thinking of giving the green light to Ukraine, for example, to launch missile strikes against Russia, deep missile strikes against Russia, if they have plans to, if they decide at any point to agree to Zelensky's zany request for Tomahawk cruise missiles, well, the Russians have already made it clear that that is an act of war, that would be construed by the Russians as an act of war, not by Ukraine, but by the United States and its allies as well. And in that case, the Russians possess the ability to respond, and to respond in the most overwhelming way, that their strategic forces are combat ready and massively powerful and are not to be disregarded or ignored by the Americans. And there are good reasons to think that the Americans are paying attention. Now, over the last couple of programs, I've discussed at inordinate length, and I'm not going to discuss it further today in this program, the whole extraordinary story about the North Korean troops in Kursk and all of this. But one very interesting statement was made by the Pentagon in response to this deployment, or alleged deployment, because I'm not convinced it exists, at least not in the way that people in the West are saying it does. The Pentagon said that if the North Koreans were to become involved in fighting in Kursk, the United States would not impose any new restrictions on weapons use by the Ukrainians against those North Korean troops. Now, that was a very, very interesting comment, because the key word, the word which practically everybody has disregarded in the way in which this comment has been discussed, is the word new. No new restrictions. So what the Pentagon is saying, and this is actually said by Sabrina Singh, the Pentagon spokesman, is that the Pentagon is going to stick to its existing restrictions. And those existing restrictions rule out use of missiles in deep strikes against Russia. It's just that the Pentagon isn't going to impose any further restrictions beyond that in response to the presence of the North Korean troops. So what the Pentagon, in fact, is saying is that with respect to overall US policy, the presence of new North Korean troops in Kursk region, assuming, of course, that they are there, actually changes nothing. The United States will not lift in response to the presence of those troops its restrictions on deep missile strikes against Russia. You have to parse these words very carefully. You have to look at what Sabrina Singh actually said in order to understand that the Pentagon is in effect again rejecting any proposal to relax its policy of prohibiting missile strikes deep inside Russia. And Putin's words at this strategic exercise, this strategic deterrence exercise, is to impress upon the Americans the wisdom of sticking by that stance. It's really, I have to say, this very elegant way in which the Pentagon has done this. They don't want to be seen publicly saying no to the Ukrainians. So they do that in this complicated way that appears to say yes, but when you read the whole comment carefully and notice the presence of the word new, you realize that the Pentagon continues to say no. Zelensky himself, in the meantime, is said to be extremely angry about the fact that the his request for Tomahawk cruise missiles has been made public by the United States. He is complaining, apparently, that this was a confidential request. He's very angry that the Americans should have publicized it. He says, what kind of confidence, what kind of privacy is there when one makes a request like this and you then read about it all in the newspapers? I think if Zelensky really thinks in this way, then he is being extraordinarily naive, just saying, if he really believes that he can come along and demand from the Americans a system like the Tomahawk, and that this won't provoke the kind of response we have seen from the Americans, publicizing the request and making it clear that it is a non-starter, then he really doesn't understand the political system in Washington and the way in which these things are handled there. Just saying. Anyway, for the moment, Russian deterrence policy continues to hold. It holds the line. The Americans, as I said, the Pentagon is taking stock of what the Russians are saying. And, of course, those articles appearing in The Economist talking about how the United States has now basically exhausted its capacity to go on helping Ukraine, that continuing to supply Ukraine with weapons on the same scale as before would expose the United States to all kinds of dangers if the US were to face crises, because weapons arsenals in the United States have become so depleted. Well, as I said, That is the single most important fact in international relations. At the moment, it's one that Zelensky doesn't seem to understand, but it is the one which explains why the United States is reacting as it is and why the Pentagon absolutely does not want to get drawn into long-term confrontation with the Russians in Ukraine or indeed anywhere else, certainly not at this time. Anyway, to move on, Putin, of course, is not just has not just had meetings about strategic forces. He's had another meeting with members of his economics team to discuss economic policy. And it brought together the top people who are part of his economic team, including his Prime Minister Mishustin, people like Siluanov, the Finance Minister, and Nabulina, the chair of the Russian Central Bank. And others were there. The Economics Minister, the Economics Ministry was also represented. But it's interesting, nonetheless, that in this meeting, Putin introduced the keynote speaker, and that speaker was Elvira Nabulina, the Russian Central Bank chair. A consistent story of Russian economic policy, ever since Nabulina was first appointed to head the central bank, I believe in 2013, is that in every argument and discussion that has taken place on economic policy, Putin has backed her at every turn. This is something which, again, I think a lot of people in the West perhaps don't quite understand. A lot of people in Russia don't either. But Nabulina is, where Putin is concerned, his major economic decision maker. And this meeting, which took place on the 28th of October, took place in the immediate aftermath of Nabulina's decision and the decision of the central bank to raise interest rates in Russia to 21%, a truly eye-watering number, or so one might think. Now, Nabulina's explanation for this decision is that the Russian economy is continuing to overheat, and that inflation is more likely to end up at 9% at the end of this year, annual inflation, as opposed to the 6.5 to 7% that she had previously anticipated. So inflation is running far higher, and this is because the economy is continuing to overheat, the economy is continuing to grow, real living standards are continuing to increase, real wages are continuing to increase. There are still shortages. In fact, there are shortages of labour and supplies, and the overall effect of that is that there is a gap, still a growing gap, in fact, between demand and supply within the Russian economy, and this is leading to higher inflation. And she's saying that interest rates will have to go higher, basically in order to slow down demand and to reduce growth. The policy in Russia, the economic policy of Putin, of Nabulina, and ultimately of the Russian government, is to lower growth in order to bring the economy back into balance and to bring inflation down. Now, Nabulina is haunted by inflation crises past. Russia experienced a period of hyperinflation in the early 1990s following the Soviet collapse. That happened following a long period of growing inflation within the Soviet economy, leading up to the moment of the Soviet collapse. And then, of course, that hyperinflation emerged and rose to, as I said, extremely high numbers. And then there was another period of briefer hyperinflation at the end of the 1990s, following the 1998 crisis. And after the 1998 crisis, when Putin eventually became president, economic growth in Russia was very high for about a decade. Growth ran at about 7% a year, but inflation throughout that time was also very high. It was consistently in double digits every year between 1998, in fact, consistently in double digits in every year after 1991, until roughly, as I remember, 2015, 2016, when finally, after very heavy and strenuous efforts, it started to fall back and remain below double digits, where it continues to be still. And both Putin and Nabulina have consistently prioritized bringing inflation down. They're prepared even to reduce growth rates in order to make sure that there is no supply crisis, there's no overheating, the economy does not overheat, and that the situation in the economy remains stable. Now, this does result in criticism, and there are critics of this policy within the government itself. The Industry Ministry and the Economics Ministry have always sought a higher growth policy. So one senses does the Prime Minister himself, Prime Minister Mishustin. Over the last few weeks, it's become increasingly clear to me that the Finance Ministry, which has historically tended to back Nabulina and the central bank, that they too think that the country can pursue a higher growth policy than the central bank allows for, and they too feel that high interest rate policy at this time is heading towards overkill. But Putin himself has never wavered at any time from his backing from Nabulina, and it is not difficult to understand why. Because the single thing that I suspect concerns Putin more than anything else is maintaining political stability within Russia. And after the experience of what happened in the late Soviet era, he has come to link political stability to maintaining macroeconomic stability. And for him, that has come to mean stability in prices. He wants a stable price situation, and he wants a stable budget situation as well. And his comments at this meeting, which has just taken place, reflect that fact. He says that GDP growth has slightly decelerated in the third quarter of this year. As I said, that is what the central bank is trying to achieve. He says that the Russian economy, however, continues its upward trajectory. According to the Ministry of Economics, GDP increased by 4.2% in the period from January to August. In fact, Nabulina is hinting, and we'll come to what Nabulina has said in a moment, but she's hinted that, in fact, growth might actually have started to increase again in September. The pace of growth might actually have started to rise again in September. Anyway, Putin then says that the projection is for growth to be at 3.9%, almost 4%, by the end of the year. He then speaks about the growth of productive forces in Russia. He says that industry, including the high-tech sector, is setting a good, promising pace. Over the past 8 months, Russia's industrial production increased by 4.5%. That, of course, includes the oil and gas sector, where growth has been restrained by agreements for OPEC, with OPEC for oil production cuts. But Putin says that manufacturing growth continues at a rate of 8.1%, and mechanical engineering, which is, of course, the spine of the Soviet industrial system, as historically created in the time of Stalin and in the decades after. Mechanical engineering sector is increasing at a rate of 20% per year. It's a huge growth. He then says that companies are operating at full capacity and personnel can do their jobs steadily and with confidence. And if we go back to what Nabulina is saying, she is talking about the fact that companies, Russian industrial companies, are now operating at full capacity. They are struggling to increase production to meet accelerated demand. And the result, that is one of the reasons why there's inflation. And she also talks about the fact that there's a general personnel shortage in Russia. And Putin talks about that too. The labour market situation reinforces this further. For the third consecutive month, unemployment in Russia remains at 2.4%, which is a record low. But then it turns out that there are still untapped labour resources that can be brought into the picture. It turns out that unemployment of young people under the age of 25 is still 9%, higher in other words, though lower than last year when it was 11.6%. So there is still some labour resources that can be tapped, but overall the labour situation for the economy is challenging. And then Putin goes on to say, I would like to underscore the challenges and imbalances persist. These issues are primarily attributed to the difficult conditions under which we are ramping up the nation's industrial, agrarian and financial potential. Such difficulties are attributable to both external sanctions and our own structural constraints, including shortages in personnel and technology, as well as logistical hurdles. And these factors are reflected, amongst other things, in the dynamics of consumer prices. I want to reiterate it is crucial not only to continuously analyse the state of affairs in the national economy, but also to promptly adjust economic policy measures to reinforce and stabilise positive trends. And he talks about the long-term objective, which is to develop supply-side economy, augment the production of goods and services domestically, launch new investment projects, and create modern employment opportunities across all industries and sectors of the economy. And then he talks about one of the ways of reining in inflation will be to set priorities in the federal budget for the next forthcoming 3-year period. This is going to be a budget focused primarily on investment, apparently. And he also says that in the period of the next 3 years, in other words, after this year, with the emergency created by the sanctions and the war starting to come to an end, it will be possible to return to the budget rule, which will mean that there should be a staged reduction in the so-called non-oil and gas deficit. In fact, the plan will be to fund budget revenue out of non-oil and gas revenues and to put aside oil and gas revenues, essentially to build up savings in the government savings funds. So that's partly the plan. And though he doesn't mention this, the intention to do one mechanism of doing that is going to be through increased taxes. Russia is about to embark on a significant tax reform, introducing at a fairly modest level, it must be said, a more progressive tax system. Now, all of this is very interesting. And as I said, the person he then invited to lead the discussion and the key decision maker is Nabulina. He says this: I suggest that we structure our discussions today with these considerations in mind. Let's begin. Miss Nabulina, the floor is yours. That's the extract that we've heard. And the others, of course, will then have been invited to make their contribution. Now, Nabulina has also spoken about all of this, and it is absolutely clear where she places what she identifies as the problem. Now, there's been a lot of talk about government spending and overspending in Russia being the problem, though the realities of Russian budget policy don't frankly reflect that. The Russian budget continues to be practically in balance. Certainly, budget spending has increased over the course of the war, and that has had a significant effect in the economy. But if you read carefully what Nabulina said over the course of a press conference that she gave a couple of days ago when she announced her decision to increase interest rates, it's clear that the major driver of economic growth, the reason the economy is growing faster than she would like it to do, why demand in the economy is growing faster than she would like, is not because of budget spending. It is because of heavy corporate lending and borrowing. Russia is going through an almost out of control investment surge. The Russian companies, in the face of escalating demand caused partly by the needs of the war, partly by the need to close gaps created by the sanctions as Western companies have pulled out. They have been embarking on a massive investment surge, and they are borrowing, and the banks are lending to them. And Nabulina talked about this at length. She said that Russian banks are prepared to lend. There is a regulatory easing measures make it possible for banks to expand lending aggressively, neglecting the need to maintain a more liquid asset structure and to accumulate additional capital buffers. She also says that long-term lending, because it is based on more to corporates, to Russian companies for investment, because it happens at low rates of interest, is not as affected by increases in interest rates as retail lending is. And overall, her major objective is to try to bring that level of lending back under control. And she says that we have raised the estimated growth rate of lending in 2024 to 15 to 18% above 2023. And she wants to reduce this lending surge. We're talking about stress again, corporate lending, she wants to reduce it to a rate of 8 to 13% in 2025. And she believes that that can be achieved despite these very high interest rates. And, well, she also says that the interest rates, the higher interest rates, will not prevent continued growth in the economy. Over the course of her press conference, not in the published statements as reported by the central bank, but in answer to questions, she actually ruled out the possibility of a recession. Now, an economy that is able to continue to grow with interest rates 21%, with inflation running, as Nabulina believes, at around 9%. In other words, real interest rates running at 10% is a very remarkable thing indeed. It reflects the very low debt dynamics within the Russian economy and the enormous overall momentum that there is in growth. Whether she is right in thinking that an economy with 21% interest rates, real interest rates over 10%, can indeed withstand recessionary pressures is another matter. But reading between the lines of what she has been saying, I suspect that if there is a real possibility of the economy moving into recession, she's going to be prepared to cut interest rates. She, however, blames herself for the fact, at least in part, for the fact that inflation this year has turned out higher than she envisaged last year or as recently as July. She gives various reasons why there's been inflation, higher inflation this year. One is high government spending. The other is, as I said, intense corporate lending. The third is higher inflation expectations, which she says is always a factor which tends to push up inflation. She is basically right about that, but I think that's the least important of the factors myself. But she then goes on to say that the Bank of Russia gave inaccurate communication at the beginning of the year. Our forecast assumed a reduction in the key rate following the slowdown in inflation. That was perceived as our intention to cut the key rate in any case. This motivated households and businesses not to reduce their demand for loans. And in fact, she's spoken about this already. I have to say, this is almost unique in my experience. A central banker coming forward and admitting that she did something wrong is astonishing. I've never seen that happen. I've never seen the Fed do it or the Bank of England do it, at least not in this way. And it really is remarkable that the central bank chair could come along and say quite openly, well, we gave wrong information to the economy at the beginning of this year. We gave everybody to think that interest rates would come down fairly soon. And the result is the higher inflation, which we now have. And that's partly the reason why I think she's going out of her way, not just to raise interest rates to these eye-watering levels, but to give everybody to think that interest rates are going to remain very high at these rates for a long time. So she's predicting interest rates at 17.5% on average this year, 17 to 20% in 2025, 12 to 13% in 2026, and 7.5% to 8.5% in 2027. Now, All of this is very interesting to people, I'm sure, but the most important reason why I've discussed this at length is because I've noticed that a narrative is starting to take hold that the Russian economy is going to collapse at some point within the next couple of years, that the sign of Nabulina raising interest rates to 21% is an indication of massive problems building up in the economy, and that all we need to do is to keep up the sanctions for just a little bit longer, and then all will be well, Russia will collapse, and the sanctions will have worked. That's not what Nabulina is saying, that's not what Putin is saying, that is not what history tells us, and is not what the facts show. Interest rates have increased because there is an investment surge underway in Russia at the present time. That investment surge is necessary over time as Russia needs to build up its supply chains, and that was what Putin was talking about. But at the present moment, it is causing stress in the economy, which is leading to higher inflation. On the back of that investment surge, obviously you have higher wages, and that also is putting pressure, demand pressure in the economy. Putin and Nabulina are acting to slow that down, and they will succeed. And there will be a return to economic balance because Putin and Nabulina prioritize macroeconomic stability. They will make sure that stability is restored in the economy. They've done that repeatedly in the past, and they will do it again. They will do it again this time. And that means, and note that Nabulina is anticipating a return to normalcy within a relatively short time, between now and 2027. That means that she does not expect an economic collapse in 2027, nor does Putin, nor does anyone else in the Russian government, and nor should we. The Russians are going to continue to achieve economic growth, and though there is going to be a slowdown, which is the objective that we see playing out here, it will not impact in any way in the way in which the special military operation is being conducted. Now, I've gone into all of this in some detail because, as I said, I think it is important to respond to these many stories that are being said by many people in the West about the state of the economy, the Russian economy at this present time. Now, this leaves you very little time today to discuss the military situation in Ukraine. It's a problem when one has to deal with two crises in the world at the same time, one in the Middle East and one in Ukraine. I have at times thought about doing separate programs about this, but then that would probably create all kinds of other problems in terms of this channel. Suffice to say that for the moment, I'm going to stick to doing one. But obviously, when one has to cover two crises, that makes for very long programs. I will say quickly a few things about the situation on the battlefronts. Firstly, the main battle remains the one I have discussed before, the one between Pokrovsk and Ugledar in southwest Ukraine. Over the course of the last few hours, we have had confirmation that Russian troops have now broken into Kurakhovo itself, this key town on the southern banks of the Kurakhovo reservoir. It is the only important place left which the Russians don't yet control between Ugledar and Pokrovsk. The Russians now control Novogrodivka and Selidovo and Ugledar itself. They've still got to capture Kurakhovo. They've now smashed into Kurakhovo. There's an extraordinary operation showing how it was done, how the Russians captured a Ukrainian tank, used that tank to smash up Ukraine's Dragon's Teeth. All this was done by Russian commandos attacking the tank on electrically powered motorcycles. This has become very much a feature of this war, by the way. And anyway, the Russians are now in Kurakhovo. The Russians, it's now confirmed, control all of not just Belogorov, but Bogoyevlenka, north of Ugleda, but they have also apparently either captured or are close to capturing the other villages to the south: Shakhtarska, Yasnaya Polyana. Most commentators appear to accept that the Russians control Yasnaya Polyana, and they appear to be clearing the village of Novoukrainka. And the Russians are also pressing forward from Selidovo. They're pushing westwards, and you can see the two pincers now starting to converge on that cluster of villages that I discussed yesterday, the villages that lie to the west of Selidovo and directly to the north of Yasnaya Polyana, villages like Andreevka, Konstantinopol, and others. And in fact, there are reports this morning of the first Russian attacks on Konstantinopol and Rozdavil, I believe that's the name of another village in this cluster, as the Russians from the north and from the south start to converge on these villages. And the risk for the Ukrainians, the danger, is that their Kurakhovo group is going to find itself completely encircled at some point over the next few days or perhaps weeks. And if that happens, and again, let me stress, I don't know the number of troops involved, 10 to 20,000 might be a reasonable guess, then, I mean, this will be, I think, a decisive victory for the Russians in the special military operation. And we're coming very close, or we're getting closer to that point. Now, what the Ukrainians are going to do in response to all of this remains to be seen. They could withdraw from Kurakhovo. That would be the logical and obvious thing to do. It's not what Zelensky and Syrskyi have ever done in these kind of situations. They've always tried to cling on to these places for as long as they can. But the Russian objective is becoming increasingly clear, and no doubt I will be discussing it at a lot more detail in my next program tomorrow. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And don't forget to check out our shop. And also, by the way, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.